There are a lot of tokenistic DEI efforts out there, yet there are actually meaningful and impactful ways of doing this work so that you can actually create behavioral changes and create environments where people can actually thrive because diverse voices, experiences, and everything is being pulled out of them. And then this in turn allows the company to thrive in the market that they're in. Curious as to what we talked about? Let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Carlos Cadogan, a certified cultural intelligence consultant who helps leaders and organizations improve their capability to function effectively in a cultural context. With over 20 years of experience leading diverse and inclusive teams successfully, I'm excited to have him share his insights with you. Well, welcome, Carlos. Can you please share with us a story, whether it's a success or a learning that you've had to overcome and has shaped the trajectory of your career and ultimately led you to launching your company, the CQ Mindset?
Yeah, hey Angela, thanks so much for having me and that intro. Thank you. Yeah, that's a big one. There's a couple things, but I'll tell the shorter version of the story. When I first became a leader, I was the youngest leader in my organization. That brought some challenges and some opportunities. And what I learned from that was, as being the youngest and only person of color in leadership at that time, the power of surrounding myself with people who didn't just look like me and think about problems the way that I thought about problems. And so it was a really informative time. My boss was a very older, white, gay man, and his insight and his way of looking at the world really shook up my own prejudice or biases towards people, not because he was gay or anything, but because he was older and he was white. And I thought they were judging me and putting me in a kind of position or box. And so he really implored me to manage a team to replace me. And so that allowed me to go and look for people who weren't just like me. And so I had the most diverse team in the organization. I had more women. I had more elderly people. I had more people of color. And what that allowed me to do, frankly, was to free up my job and freed up me to do my job better because I wasn't doing the everyday kind of jobs. I let the team do that. I let the team make decisions on their own and check my blind spots. And so I don't know if that's a great story, but it really that team and that leader really shaped my view of how I want to run my teams. And if I was able to run an organization, and the fruits came out of that, we were the most successful team, and we got along the best. We had challenges like everybody else, but that openness and curiosity really led us to really outperform the other teams.
Nice. And I want to dive a little bit deeper into the piece where you mentioned that you ultimately learned how to build a team around you that ultimately would replace you in the
Mhm.
sense that it means that you actually have more capacity than leaders who are micromanagers, right? And it also gave you the ability to help develop others. So, as a newer leader at that time, I'm assuming it's not an easy thing to do, right? Because
Mhm.
part of it, I'm assuming you're just like, well, I want to make sure I have a level of job security. And there's a lot of that aspects that we think of, right? So then I'm curious, like, what allowed you to truly lean into that and be like, you know what, like, this is actually not a threat. This is going to make my life easier as a leader if I do this.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I took that a lot from my life. I mean, I grew up in a suburb of Toronto. I'm here in Ontario, Canada, and I grew up in the suburb of Scarborough in the 80s. I'm an 80s kid. My friends, if I had 10 friends, two or three of them were black, the other seven or eight were South Asian, East Asian, Macedonian, Greek, Italian, Jewish, like you name it. And so from a very early age, I guess because you want to make friends, because you're trying to navigate the whole world, your kids are often curious, right? We're trying to learn about things like, why do you do things differently? Why does your house smell? Your house smells different than my house. Like, you ask questions, even at times they may not seem appropriate, but they come from a place of curiosity. And so I just took that experience, that foundation of my life to my working life. I didn't know everything. And so the best way to find out is to ask questions and to be curious. And if you and I were working together, we weren't getting along, my mindset wasn't Angela's difficult. It's why isn't this working? What am I doing wrong? Am I communicating? Like, what's the challenge here? And so my curiosity would bridge a lot of gaps. So that's what really drove me, was my own personal curiosity. And yeah, it led me to some success.
Totally can relate to the whole house smelling different, lunch smelling different, and then that curiosity piece, right? Like I appreciate all that, and your self awareness says a lot about your leadership success. Then, and I kind of want to dive into the leadership epiphany part. Like, what has been the biggest leadership epiphany you've had to date, where you're just like, you know what, like this is the through line that will help me get through my next chapter as I continue to scale my business.
Yeah, it's not about me. Simply put, when you're a leader and you're right. You want to succeed. You want to prove your worth. You want to have a job security, and then you hire people who may know things more than you know, or better at solving problems or whatever. But I didn't let that hold me back. And it wasn't about me. It was about our end result of what we're trying to do. That organization, we're trying to grow our database. We were trying to meet our customers where they were. And so I was in our customer base. Our customer base were mostly women of a certain age, married with children, and I'm none of those things. And so doesn't mean that I can't have an opinion or a thought of how we could do some procedures and policies, but I knew if I wanted to really speak, I had to surround myself with people who were from that demographic. And so, yeah, I think I just learned really quickly that it wasn't about me, that it was about the team, about the individuals on the team, and how to get them in the best position to work effectively together and solve complex problems. And the first thing you do is you just have to remove yourself, which is difficult, but you remove yourself and try to let the team grow as they should organically.
I appreciate that. And now I want to switch gears a little bit into the CQ mindset because I want to focus specifically on how does the CQ mindset even play a role in moving beyond superficial DEI efforts, right? So can you
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about what the CQ mindset is and why you decided to focus on this?
I've been always passionate about inclusive work my whole life. Again, going back to my roots, my parents immigrated here in the 70s from Barbados with my brother. They had me. And I grew up, as I said earlier, in a very multicultural city and then moved to one later in life that wasn't. And that juxtaposition really shook my foundations. And I realized how important it is for us to effectively communicate and navigate the differences with ourselves in a way that's respectful, empathetic. And so I started the business because I realized the world we're in now, the time or place we're in now, there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of people talking, but they're not really saying anything, and they're definitely not talking to each other. And so that's why we started the business 4 years ago. And the reason why we call it the CQ mindset is to your point, your question is, a lot of DEI efforts, and I think any person who's a DEI advocate or a person on the receiving end of DEI training, a lot of it seems to be a lot of check the box kind of, let's do this bias training, let's do this thing. But really, what we're trying to do is give people the foundational skills to navigate complex situations. That's what we're trying to do. I don't know how a list of biases, knowing what horn effects means versus halo effect, I don't know how that actually benefits someone's actual behavior. It's knowledge, and knowledge is part of a behavioral change. But then what do I do with it? What are the action steps that I need to take? And so we started the business because, and we call it the CQ mindset. Is of course, CQ is a short form for cultural intelligence, which you mentioned. That's where it started. It starts with the mind. A lot of the D&I efforts start from the heart, which is great. That's where I'm at. But there's a mindset that needs to happen first, to understand a mindfulness and self-awareness that you mentioned earlier that needs to happen along with that. And that's going to lead us from our motivations to our knowledge, to how we strategize, and then ultimately what people are looking for is our actions, how we change our behaviors.
100%. And I'm curious, like from a business perspective, did you have to sell your services in a way where you don't actually call it DEI? Because I noticed that a lot of my consulting friends, whether they're in Alberta or in the States, they've said that unfortunately, like the people that hold the bags of money when it comes to these initiatives are becoming really deterred by the term DEI because of the
Mhm.
fact that, like you said, there are individuals out there who simply do it in a way where it's a checkbox or it's a lip service. Therefore, the executives don't see the return on what these effective DEI initiatives can actually do. So, like, in your experience, like how have you effectively communicated your services so that you don't have to and meet the friction of a lot of what's going on when it comes to DEI backlash?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I like to say one thing for answer. I think the backlash isn't a surprise. I think anything that burns that bright doesn't shine that bright for that long, and so unfortunately, we had some things happen in the social square, plus the COVID, that I think allowed people to think about things differently, and that led to a real explosion of DEI. And like any other profession, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every DNI consultant or practitioner is excellent, just like not every teacher, every doctor, every police officer is. But I think so, a lot of the backlash is misinformation and misguided. Sure, have there probably been some not great training sessions that people experience? Sure, but you can say that for anything. So that's my one thing I like to say about that. But the reason why we call it the CQ mindset and the reason why I started working with cultural intelligence is that, and I'm not knocking it. I think I'm a DI enthusiast. I think it's something that as a society, as a person living on the street, in the neighborhood, in an organization, no matter what your age, should be something that we discuss. But I felt like what would work best for me personally is when I like to learn is that I like to people to speak like they're speaking to me. And I realized very early on that my lived experience growing up in a very multicultural place in Scarborough, and I would talk to some of my friends, maybe in Canada, definitely in some parts of the United States, who've never left their state, let alone their little town. I had to meet them where they were. And so I could come with all the DIs and all the list of biases. And again, it's what does this mean to me? Because I don't have to deal with that, or why should I care? And so for me, ultimately, I think what DI work is, and this is my own personal bias, I guess I would say, is that I think it really is about understanding the different behavioral ways that we operate and the way our culture, when I think of culture, I don't think of my skin tone versus your skin tone, my gender versus your gender. That's part of it. But it's also what jobs I had before I started working with you or met you. Where did I grow up? How did my parents view the world? Those things are really important. Those are the things that actually cause the friction, really. I think black versus white gender stuff is complicated, but it's actually kind of easy to navigate. What's difficult is when I'm microaggressively putting you down or not lifting up your ideas. That's when it starts to get really dicey. And for that to understand those things is to really understand people's behaviors, their cultures. And so for me, I haven't had to reframe my work so much. I know some of my clients have had to reframe what we do internally because they sold it as a DI program. But for me, I've always told them since day one, yes, I'm going to talk about creating inclusive environments. Yes, I'm going to talk about certain things that we might hear, like psychological safety, but I'm going to go beyond those hot button words and tell you why they're important for your business. And ultimately, it's how do we make the best decisions in a world that's moving so quickly, making decisions with people who don't look like us, who are not from our generation, maybe from a different part of the country, have different backgrounds, different skill sets, different departments. How do we make the best, most informed decision? And to us, and to me, that's leveraging diverse thoughts and opinions from diverse people. And so we've always sold it that way. And so for us, it hasn't been so much of a hit. I just think internally for some of our clients, I think they've had to reword what we do. But we've always been that way, kind of. And that's not because I'm embarrassed by DI. I'm not. It's just more of I didn't want the conversation to stop there. I think the conversation is deeper than that, and that's why I've avoided it.
This is all great. And this is why, like, I'm excited to chat a little bit more about the environment
Mm,
piece because
mm,
I noticed, like, even with the words like psychological safety and then going back to the
mm,
DEI, right? Again, a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, like this again, right? But it's not just like the word in itself, it's the consequences of not having that is, like you said, or the
mm,
impact on bottom line, right? So let's just say you walk into a client's environment and you're like, okay, clearly there's a divide between people because some are afraid of being canceled given the
mm,
initiatives that were sold or implemented in a way where in some ways it almost feels anti-racist or anti something, right? And then on the flip side of things, you have people who are basically apathetic at this point because they're just like, I don't even know what I can say or what I can't say, right? Even though the core of it should be respectful, and get shit done, right? I think that
Right,
the
right,
biggest thing of it, right, to make a
right,
business
right.
function.
That's right.
So I'm curious for you, it's like when you walk into a client's environment like this, with the work that you do, how do you then evaluate that environment and empower the leader to be like, okay, maybe these are 1 to 3 things that you should keep in mind to restore this before we can even do further work from a CQ mindset perspective?
Yeah, I think the first thing we do is talk about the elephant in the room. I mean, we do an exercise where we rate people. Let me back up. The first thing we do is break down what culture is. And so when I say culture, often when people will say, well, look at Angela, look at Carlos, and they have different cultures. Their backgrounds are different. They're different genders, they're different ethnicities. That is culture, and that's part of it. But culture is more complex. And we talk about culture from a more broad perspective at the CQ mindset, which is the way we do things around here. So the way we do things around here could be as an organization as a whole. So I can be, Telus or someone, and you could be Rogers, and the environment culturally can be different, even though they're in the same industry. But even in those organizations, in each team, the culture is different. The way people get stuff done on the technology side, the way they make decisions and communicate and collaborate can be very different than the sales team or the marketing team. These teams have to work together. And so what we try to do through the background framework of DI is if your technology team and your sales team isn't getting along, or if you have a contact team that's not mixing, it's possible that Carlos is just difficult. Trust me, just ask my wife. It's 100% possible that Carlos is just difficult to work with. But maybe it's because Carlos's way of working, the way he likes to collaborate, form relationships, and communicate is different than members of his team. He's not wrong. They're not wrong. It's just different. So how do we bridge those differences? That's where we kind of start, which is what's the problem here? Because kind of leading to your question is when I often get reached out to, the first thing people want to do is some sort of bias training. And I always say no, because you haven't even told me what your challenge is yet. Well, like, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? And generally speaking, when it comes to that cancer culture part, what we do is we have an exercise where we ask leaders to talk about things that are important to them, their ethnicity, their gender, their professional background, their social economics, those kind of things. Just rate what they are to you. Then we ask them to rate them on a level of 1 to 10 of importance. And then we ask them, well, how comfortable are you sharing that at work? And that exercise, for those people who may not have lived, in a life where they felt, um, prejudices before, it's a very enlightening exercise for those individuals because they didn't realize how comfortable. And I'll give you a real quick example. I guess I continue to ramble here, but in the States, the biggest thing is not gender. It's not, sexuality. The biggest thing that people are uncomfortable talking about at work is politics, which doesn't surprise any of us who pays attention to probably U.S. politics. But that's the dicey issue. And so but seeing that on paper, how comfortable people are, we start to think about what are the whys? Why aren't we talking? Why are we comfortable with it? And so I try to really break down to these organizations is understanding their culture because everybody thinks they're hiring for culture and understand their culture, but they don't. Their culture has different levels based on where you are in the company and based on your department. So we start from that framework and that allows us to go deeper into those things like gender, seniority, well, he's a baby boomer and I'm a Gen Xer and they're stuck in their ways or they just want to rip everything apart. That allows us to go deeper because we're framing it around culture and behavioral values versus I'm a white guy who may vote conservative and I may be, a black guy who may vote this way, if that makes any sense.
Okay, and I want to ask about the whole managing that multi-generational, multicultural workforce. So leaders face all these different challenges on top of what they're facing right now. So what would you say is like a trend that you're noticing that has like leaders should think about as they continue to manage this very complex and diverse workforce?
Yeah, I think organizations are starting to learn that, as I said to a client recently, is you will train their grocery chain, and you'll never put a cashier in front of a till without training them, but you will promote Angela to senior director and offer her no training. And it doesn't mean that the frontline person is less important. It's not about that. It's just about we don't train people, and so listen, people are going to balk against DI, sure. The reality is most of our organizations are already diverse. Are they diverse enough on certain levels? Probably not, but they're already diverse. And any organization that's at a certain size and they're looking to grow, even I would say small ones, are looking not only beyond their state or their provinces or wherever you are in the world, but their countries. So now you're going to be working with and selling to and collaborating with people who are not like you. So you can avoid it all you like. But if you want to be successful, and I know for some people who love DEI like me, hearing about the business side of it isn't what they want to hear. But for some people, that's what it is. And so from a business perspective, if you want to be better, then you have to be understanding of those different cultures, which means people in different generations, people who want to work remotely. I'm a Gen Xer. I was willing to drive, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for a job. That's what my parents did. So I thought that's what I wanted to do. My niece and nephew who are Gen Z, Gen Y, they will never do that. They will take $30,000, $40,000 less to work close to where they are to have a better quality of life. I'm not wrong. They're not wrong. It's just different. And so if you want to be a successful leader now, you have to manage people from different generations, different expectations, and it's complicated. There's no one training, no one company, CQ mindset, or anyone else is going to solve for that. But what I will say is an effective leader who has to navigate that has two fundamental things. They're curious, they're motivated to understand, and then they're empathetic. They're trying to see things from Angela's perspective. That doesn't mean they agree with Angela. They don't have to. This isn't sympathy. You just want to see from their perspective. Those types of leaders who have those, I hate the word soft skills, I think they're essential skills. Those essential skills are going to navigate those issues more effectively than someone who is closed off and not willing to do that.
Great call out. And as we slowly wrap up our conversation, before we switch gears, I want to
Mm-hmm.
ask you, if I'm a leader, I'm going to make my first hire and I want to understand, how do I hire from that cultural lens, right? To understand that, hey, some of these behaviors are things I want to keep in mind. What does that actually look like to set a business up for success with their first hire and scaling? What would you say is maybe 1 to 3 things that a business owner or a leader should keep in mind?
So whether you're a hiring person, you're owning the business, you're hiring somebody new, challenge your assumptions because yes, it might be easier for me to collaborate and work with Angela. However, that doesn't mean that Angela and I working together are the best duo to solve complex problems. And so we tend to want to work with or hire people who look or act or behave like us in some degree. And that's fine. That's human nature. That's how we get along. But from a working perspective, I would argue it's best to have diversity on your team. And so if you find yourself constantly interviewing or looking at people who see the world as you do, push beyond that and try to select somebody who doesn't, because that person who is not a yes person, that person who isn't just going to agree with everything that you say or see the world just like you, it's going to help you check your blind spots and you're going to do the same for them to solve complex problems. So again, I just think we have to get away from that. Now here I am calling out bias-less things, but that affinity that we want to work with somebody who's just like us, who fits the mold that we think will be effective. We have to be a little more diligent to push beyond that and hire people who are juxtaposed to how we see the world.
Okay. There's a fundamental difference between differences in how we see the world, differences in how we communicate, differences how we work. There's that fine line between how we can make it work and actually make magic happen in the workplace versus it's so different that the friction actually completely impacts morale or team effectiveness, right? So I'm curious
Sure.
from your perspective, like, what is the gauge for that, right? To see, okay, this is where differences can help versus once you cross over the line here, this is where the differences actually could tear your team apart.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the biggest thing you have to think about is, and you can do this through multiple ways, through simulations, assessments, you know, panel discussions, panel interviews, which I think are really great. But you want to find people who are just flexible. And if there's somebody who's unwilling to be self-aware, empathetic, and curious, I don't really care much about their skill set. That person's probably going to cause problems on a diverse team. The reality is that teams that are homogeneous, teams that think and look and act the same, their stress level on those teams are very, very low because, we all see things the same way. Inviting diverse people gives you better decisions, but it creates friction. And that's why we believe that you need cultural intelligence to understand that, because what it does, it helps you understand your motivations and your drive, first of all. So before we even get to behavioral change, what's my motivation? My motivations and my drive can be very different than yours. Once I have my motivation, what is my knowledge? What do I understand about the differences between me and Angela that's potentially causing these challenges? And then what's my strategy to overcome those challenges? Right? And from those strategies, those things can be like having feedback sessions. So say I'm a leader and I've asked Angela or the whole team to give me honest feedback on how my performance. We're very low hierarchical here now in Western society in terms of leadership, right? No more glass doors, no more closed up offices. I walk around the halls, I get to meet everybody. We're not, this isn't the 80s and 90s anymore. But for some people, they're very uncomfortable calling out their leader in a group setting. Some leaders will think of someone not giving feedback as someone who's not connected to the business, someone who doesn't care. But that's not true. That person's just not comfortable behaviorally in that scenario. So my strategy would be, okay, I'm going to tell anyone who wants to tell me right now in this town hall how I'm doing, go ahead. For those who are uncomfortable, send it in an email or a pulse survey or whatever it is, or come talk to me one-on-one in my office. That's a strategy piece that you can use. It sounds so simple, but it's powerful. We've used it before. And that strategy then leads to my actions and my behaviors, which is that. How do I change my meetings, right? How do I change the way that I show up? So that framework of motivation, drive, knowledge, strategy, and action, that key skill set and training that we give people to overcome when there's someone difficult. Listen, there's some just difficult people out there. And if they don't have curiosity and empathy, they ain't going to work. I don't care what their skill set is. They're left to be moved on from. But just because somebody doesn't communicate the way that you communicate, or is maybe not as warm and fuzzy as you are, or whatever that may be, all I'm saying is, what we're saying is, go beyond that initial putting that person in a box and try to understand your motivation to bridge these differences and understand with some knowledge of what's going on there, so you can strategize and then maybe change your behavior in yourself and maybe that person.
100% crystal clear. And I am so appreciative that you gave that breakdown and that understanding. And I know that was a very broad question and you handled that like a champ. So,
No problem. No.
um, as we slowly wrap up our conversation, when it comes to unleashing the potential of individuals and organizations, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
The one thing that comes to mind, I think, as senior leaders, whether it's an individual or the C-suite or the senior, whatever you want to call yourselves, do what you would ask others to do, right? Most organizations now are asking their people to collaborate better, create a great environment that's healthy for people to give feedback and be respectful to each other. But are they doing it to themselves as a group, and are they showing that to the organization? Leaders are such an important North Star for an organization, especially when you come to sensitive topics around conflict, DEI, those type of things. If I sit here and make Angela go through training for conflict resolution and I'm terrible at conflict, where either by avoiding it or just not willing to do it, why should Angela do it? And so I think the biggest thing as a leader is there's this, and it's hard, but we have to now understand that we are working with humans. I think most of our evolution of our societies has been getting work done through people. And now we're realizing that these people actually are attached to families that have other things outside of the work function. So whether that person is working remotely, whether that person is another generation, as leaders, how are we showing up? And I'll always go back to those two boring words. I'm sorry, but are we being curious about the different people in our organization? Are we trying to see things from their perspective? That doesn't mean we're going to do everything that the people want. We can't. But do I make them feel like they're seen and heard and that I understand their point of view? And I'll give a real quick anecdote to that. In some of our training, we show an image of two cartoon characters arguing, and they're standing in front of the number 9 or the number 6, and they're yelling at each other. And I use that as a really great example of empathy, because the truth is I don't know if that number is a 9 or a 6. And based on where you're standing, both these individuals are correct. However, if one person just got up and walked to the other side, That person could say, listen, I still believe it's a 9, but I completely understand why you think it's a 6 because now I'm sitting where you're sitting. And that little mindset shift, that little action, whether it's in your mind, physically, changes everything. It really, really does. Even if you don't give the people exactly what they want or they don't get the resolution they want, I'm sorry, you can't work from home 5 days a week. But if you're willing to take the step that I understand why it's important for you to be around your house more because you have an elderly sick parent or you have a hard time with daycare, whatever it may be, that goes so far as an organization to that person. But we need to be able to take that leap without the fear of taking that leap means that now we're converted or that we've now, sold our values out. A rightly timed cultural and intelligent conversation can change everything.
Appreciate that visual, and now it's forever ingrained in me because it is so powerful, right?
Right, right.
My last question to you is what is one thing that's top of mind for you, whether it's a way for the audience to have a better understanding of how they could potentially help you and or just again understand like what you're up to and yeah.
Yeah, for me personally,
Yes.
for us, yeah. I mean, for us, we're really interested in working with teams and organizations who really are striving to create a more human centric way of approaching doing work. We're being inundated with AI and stuff that can be really great, but also can be seen threatening to people. We have more generations working in the workforce together than ever because of the rise of cost of living. All of us are just trying to do the same thing. We're trying to work so we have enough money to put a roof over our head, feed our loved ones, and sleep in our beds and feel secure. Like that's it. And it's so easy to get wrapped up in all the other stuff, but that's what we're trying to do. And so, I'm excited to work with any organization that wants to help their leaders, be better leaders. There's a lot of leadership skills that leaders need to have, but we really believe this culture intelligence piece is part of it because who they're going to be leading and who they're selling their products and services to are going to be different people than themselves. And so how do they do that effectively? And so that's what we really want to do. But also what we hope for, and we've seen this in our own lives and some clients' lives, is that it doesn't just change the way they do business, but it changes the way they operate in their homes when their sons or daughters come home with someone who's culturally different than themselves, if there's a new neighbor in the street who, doesn't cut their lawn and has this perfect green grass lawn but wants to grow fruits and they start freaking, like it just changes people's perspectives and it leads to actual dialogue, not just us falling back into our camps and shouting at each other over the internet. And so uh, I'm interested in working with people and organizations who really, really want to just effectively work and collaborate with people whether they look exactly like them or someone who doesn't. And that's who we want to be working with. And we take a lot of pride doing it.
Such important work. So, Carlos, thank you so much for taking the time to share your story and insights today. I really appreciate it. And to everyone else that's tuned into another episode, thank you so much for your time and attention. It means more to me than you'll know, and I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next
Well,
episode. Till then, stay safe.